So it was a freezing Minnesota winter morning while I was in college. I had just left my dorm room, the dorm I was living in, and I went out to the parking lot to start my car. And while it warmed up, I rummaged through my car. I was looking for an ice scraper, but I couldn't find an ice scraper anywhere in my car. So what did I do? I did what any college student would do. I reached for my wallet, I pulled out my debit card, and I began scraping my window with it. And of course, this worked for a while until my debit card got cold, it froze, and it snapped in half. Folks, here's what you know. You're smarter than me. Just because you can use a debit card as an ice scraper, it doesn't mean that you should. Folks, thanks for joining us for our study of the book of First Corinthians. We're looking at what Paul had to say about living the good life. And today, we're taking a look at First Corinthians chapter 6, verses 12 through 20. And throughout this whole passage, Paul is going to invite the Corinthians to consider how they are using their bodies sexually, because Paul has discovered that sexual immorality has become a serious issue for the Corinthians. And so Paul's going to remind them that just like my debit card ice scraper, just because you can doesn't mean that you should when it comes to, well, how you use your body. And to get at this, Paul starts in the beginning of this passage by quoting a popular slogan that the Corinthians were familiar with, and they were probably using it to justify their immoral behavior. In verse 6, he quotes, "Everything is permissible for me. I can do what I like, when I like, how I like it. I'm free." And in a sense, those Corinthians, they were right. There were no laws against the ways they were practicing their sexuality, but Paul reminds us that though everything may be lawful, by no means is everything beneficial for you and me. Just because you can, Paul says, doesn't mean you should. You can use a debit card for an ice scraper, but don't expect to buy groceries with it later. In fact, Paul suggests that to God, what you do with your body, it matters. It actually matters a lot. Paul argues that it matters for two reasons. First off, if you're a follower of Jesus, it matters because you belong to Jesus. Your whole self belongs to Jesus. Your body, your mind, your spirit, it all belongs to God. There isn't somehow a spiritual part of you that belongs to God. What you are and do as a Christian, you are and do as your whole self, not just the sort of spiritual part of you, which includes what you do sexually. Secondly, Paul insists that as followers of Jesus, our bodies are God's temple, he says. And temples in that day were where gods lived, they believed. For Paul, God actually lives in you in the form of the Holy Spirit. It isn't the case that you only interact with God when you pray or go to worship or do sort of religious things. God lives in you every minute of every hour of every day, whatever you are doing. So what's Paul's advice? When you're faced with sexual temptation, what does Paul say? Paul says, you run. I love it. It's simple but wise advice. Advice that saves marriages, that guards against heartache. Advice that honors vows, it strengthens trust and respects relationships. Just run, Paul says. Paul concludes this section by reminding us that if you pay a lot for something, you treat it with care. If you pay a lot of money for a house, you don't spray paint silly patterns on the front door. If you pay a lot for a really good book, you don't tear out a page or write your shopping list in the margin. Paul reminds us that God paid the ultimate price of his own life to rescue you. And so Paul challenges the Corinthians and you and me. He says, glorify God in your whole self, your body, your mind, your spirit. Friends, a couple of questions for you as we close. Finish this sentence. God created my body for blank. How would you finish that sentence? And secondly, why do so many people get themselves into trouble sexually? Why do so many people get themselves in trouble sexually?